talking today about the question, the evidence for God. A few years ago, before I started finding my way in the world, I used to think that evidence for God was not something you could ever have. I thought that faith was a take it or leave it matter, and you could never really have evidence for it. But before I talk about what I've come to consider is evidence for God, I want to just pose a different question, just for a minute or two, before we get into all of that. I want to ask the question, what if? What if? What if God is there? What if God is real? What if the Christian God is real? If God is real, then life suddenly becomes infused with a purpose, a significance, a meaning, a value. A whole new level of purpose, meaning, significance, and value. Belief in God, many say, brings stability through times of trial. A friend of mine with a young family received a diagnosis a couple of weeks ago, stage 4 stomach cancer, and our whole team is praying for him on our knees at the moment. And one of the things that he is depending on and leaning on is his friendship, his relationship with God. It's a stability with him through a bleak and tough time of trial and suffering. A belief in God also gives you somebody to say thank you to. Somebody who you can say wow with. Somebody who you can marvel with at the world around you and your experiences in it. So maybe God and belief in God could be attractive, significant, bring stability, infuse life with purpose, with a sense of significance sometimes, with meaning, with hope perhaps. Somebody you can say thank you to. And somebody maybe who might give us a way of dealing with our nature inside ourselves, because we've all got things that we do that we're not proud of, things that we wouldn't want shown up on the screen behind me. Now, I haven't always believed in God, but I've come to believe in God personally, not just as an idea, as a philosophy idea or a concept, but I've actually come to believe in God personally in a relationship. And if you take anything away from the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like you to remember this, that the Christian God doesn't declare himself as an object of philosophy to be prodded and boiled down to the rags of metaphysics, but he offers himself as a living person for a living, breathing, loving, grace-filled, real friendship, a real relationship. He's utterly different. I want to watch a clip now from Sherlock with you. I wonder if you're a Sherlock fan. And in this introduction to the character of Sherlock, we'll see him using deduction, inference, intuition, to make an analysis that it's not a scientific proof, but it's right on the money. Enjoy the clip.
Okay, you've got questions.
Yeah, where are we going?
Crime scene. Next.
Who are you? What do you do?
What do you think?
I'd say private detective.
But
The police don't go to private detectives.
I'm a consulting detective. The only one in the world that invented the job.
What does that mean?
It means when the police are out of their depth, which is always, they consult me.
The police don't consult amateurs.
When I met you for the first time yesterday, I said Afghanistan or Iraq. You looked surprised.
Yes, how did you know?
I didn't know, I saw. Your haircut, the way you hold yourself says military. But your conversation as you entered the room
A bit different from my day.
said trained at Bart, so army doctor, obvious. Your face is tanned, but no tan above the wrists. You've been abroad, but not sunbathing. Your lips really bad when you walk, but you don't ask for a chair and you stand like you've forgotten about it. So it's at least partly psychosomatic. That says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatic. Wounded in action then. Wounded in action, suntan, Afghanistan or Iraq.
You said I had a therapist.
Got a psychosomatic limp, of course you've got a therapist. Then there's your brother. Your phone, it's expensive, email-enabled MP3 player. Are you looking for a flash? You wouldn't waste money on this. It's a gift then. Scratch is not one, many over time. It's been in the same pocket as keys and coins. Man sitting next to me wouldn't treat as one luxury item like this, so it's had a previous owner. Next bit's easy, you know it already.
the engraving?
Harry Watson, clearly a family member who's given you his old phone. Not your father, this is a young man's gadget. Could be a cousin, but you're a war hero who can't find a place to live. Unlikely you've got an extended family, certainly not one you're close to, so brother it is. Now Clara, who's Clara? 3 kisses says there's a romantic attachment. Expense of the phone says wife, not girlfriend. She must have given it to him recently. This model's only 6 months old. Marriage in trouble then. 6 months on, he's just given it away. If she'd left him, he would have kept it. People do. Sentiment. No, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you. That says he wants you to stay in touch. You're looking for cheap accommodation, and you're not going to your brother for help. It says you've got problems with him. Maybe you liked his wife. Maybe you don't like his drinking.
How can you possibly know about the drinking?
Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Power connection, tiny little scuff marks around the edge of it. Every night he goes to plug it in to charge, but his hands are shaking. You never see those marks on a sober man's phone, never see a drunk's without them. There you go, see, you were right.
I was right. Right about what?
The police don't consult amateurs.
Pretty amazing deductive skills in operation there. And actually, detective work is quite an interesting field because it involves looking at clues and keys. And it's not just about looking at scientific information, it's also about looking at circumstantial information, historical information, testimony, different types of evidence and clues. And when things become serious, we do put our confidence in these methods. Now, there are all kinds of arguments and clues that people talk about when they talk about God and the existence of God. But I want you to imagine maybe that a thief might have broken into your house for some reason. Maybe it was a benevolent thief that filled your freezer with lovely Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And you wanted to work out who this beneficent imposter break-in was, who this criminal was. And maybe you see, okay, there's a shoe on the floor and there's a fingerprint on the window, and it's quite difficult to work out who it is because it's only a partial fingerprint and a few people have that size of shoe. But then you see a little bit of fiber from maybe a jacket or a bit of clothes, and you think maybe you recognize that as somebody you know, and then you see that your security camera has flashed a photo as well, and it's caught the back of them, and it looks like somebody, and you begin to bring together all of these different clues, each clue on their own not enough maybe to answer the question conclusively. But together, you start to arrange all the things together, and it's enough to secure a conviction and hopefully the opportunity for more Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I think that God presents himself to us in a way that is gentle. I think he does this because he's interested in a particular type of way of relating to us. I don't think God wants to force you to have to believe in him against your will, against your mind, against your heart. I think God would like you to discover him because you want to choose to know him. It's a deeper level of personhood. It's a deeper level of valuing a person. It's not just simply treating you as an intellect or a mind who sees things and then works through the evidence. It's actually saying to you, do you want to know me? Do you want relationship with me? That actually dignifies each of us. So we're going to look at 4 different areas, 4 different types of clues. John Lennox has already helpfully touched on a few of these. And the first one we're going to look at is looking up at the universe, looking up at the cosmos all around us. When we look at the universe, then there are generally 2 types of clues people will point to. There's the original first cause, the first starting point of the universe, the hunt for the big banger, if you like, or the original mover, the prime mover, the first cause. Or there are another second type of clue that we can look at here, where we look at whether there are instances of design, whether there are examples of God's handiwork in the way that he made the world, or maybe biological systems explain themselves entirely on their own. Maybe some other explanation offers itself. And it's possible that we'll see design in various different areas. John Lennox talked about, just briefly at the end of his presentation, DNA and information. Some have talked about biological design and being able to see that. Others have talked about how the universe being intelligible, in other words, being something that we can understand, that our minds and our thinking can latch onto and we can explore different bits of it. Some have talked about how that itself needs an explanation. Einstein says the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. The most incomprehensible, the hardest thing to understand about the universe is that it is understandable. I'm going to pull one of these threads out, and it's the thread called cosmic fine-tuning. Cosmic fine-tuning. Let me explain what I mean by that. Did you know that you are much, much less likely to win the lottery than for certain other things to happen to you. I found this website which helpfully lists a few different things that you can hope for, perhaps, if you don't happen to be investing your worldly wealth in the lottery. Here are some things that you maybe want to avoid. Getting struck by lightning, it's more likely for that to happen to you, 1 in a million, than winning the lottery. Being killed by a vending machine, that's also more likely than winning the lottery. Or dying from being left-handed and using a right-handed product incorrectly. 1 in 4.4 million chance of that. Now, some slightly more optimistic ones. Having identical quadruplets, becoming a movie star, becoming an astronaut, becoming a professional athlete, or winning Olympic gold medal, all more likely than winning the lottery. But imagine that you know somebody who actually does win the lottery. Perhaps the first time you say, wow, that's lucky, maybe we should hang out more. And then it happens again to that same person. Ooh, now I think that has happened. But then it happens again, and it happens again, and then it happens again, and again. And in all, it happens 42 times. Week after week, the same person wins the lottery. Now, what should we think? What do you think? Cheating. Yes, you think there's cheating going on. It's so unlikely that this could happen that we immediately infer, we immediately look to some sort of explanation in terms of somebody's messing with the system. The system can't produce this by itself, so we've got to look outside it to explain the very unlikely thing that's happening within it. And so over the last 30 or 40 years, the so-called fine-tuning argument for God, a type of design argument, has suggested that we should come to exactly the same conclusion when we're thinking about the lottery and somebody winning it 42 times as we should looking at the cosmology of our universe. Have a look at this video because it goes into 3 of those lottery-winning situations which show us exactly what sort of odds we're talking about.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, there'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge.
So, if we say it's a principle of knowledge that something is as it seems to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken, called the Principle of Credulity, if you want to look it up, from Richard Swinburne, In other words, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it swims like a duck, tastes like a duck, then it's a duck. And it's up to somebody else who says it's not a duck to actually provide evidence for that belief or for that claim. The agnostic professor Paul Davies, cosmologist, says everybody agrees that the universe looks as if it were designed for life. So, our first clue, let's put it like this. We ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we are mistaken. The fine-tuning of the Big Bang of our universe seems like it was designed. The conclusion is, therefore, that in the absence of sufficient counter-evidence, we should believe that that fine-tuning is an example or clue of design pointing to a designer. Now I want to look into human beings. I want to briefly look at a couple of reasons. Now, John Lennox has just touched on the argument from reason, the argument from mind. And he said, how can we trust reason if reason and thinking's primary purpose is not truth, but survival? So that's one argument. Let's just park that there for a moment. You might want to ask about that at the end. I want to talk about right and wrong and morality, we might say. Now, Martin Luther King was a famous civil rights activist in America about 30 or 40, 50 years ago. Here's an excerpt from one of his speeches.
About the true meaning of its creed, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
An amazing and inspirational man. Martin Luther King was a civil rights reformer. He was a cultural reformer. Now, we sometimes think that the culture that we're in defines what's right and wrong. But the existence of somebody like Martin Luther King presents a problem to that view, because the civil rights activist looks at the culture around them and says, culture is wrong here. Something is mistaken here. There is something more to what we're doing and what we're seeing, and just what we've legislated is actually wrong. And so he says things like, we have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And regardless of your politics, you have to recognize that the moment when Barack Obama was voted President of the United States was a historic moment in terms of the American civil rights movement and that landscape. That wouldn't have been conceivable in Martin Luther King's day. It was 5 decades ago that Martin Luther King delivered that speech. And there has been progress through a story, through great suffering, through great tragedy, and there's still so much work to do in that great continent. But there's been progress. Somebody stood against their culture and said, something is wrong here, and we need to go in this direction. And then things moved towards that direction. There was progress. And we sometimes create these maps, don't we, where we look at international trafficking, or we look at sweatshops, or we look at something that's unjust in the world. And we create this global map, and we have different countries that are different colors because of how unjust those countries are, and how terrible circumstances. And it's meant to alert us and get us to focus our eyes and to take things more seriously and to be more engaged with these questions. But it all presupposes that we have a certain vantage point, a position where we're making a judgment over culture, where we're saying that cultures can be further or nearer to a standard of right and wrong. So I think we share values. We see differences in morality and right and wrong, but I think we share a huge amount in common. The reformer like Martin Luther King, the progress towards some sort of moral dimension, some sort of moral law, things are better now than they were. If you say those sorts of things and think those sorts of things, those are clues to some sort of standard that we're moving towards or moving away from, something that we judge culture on the basis of. So I want to say a couple of things about right and wrong. I want to ask whether, when we say things about right and wrong, whether we can sustain those things in terms of the big picture of the universe. Is it that our statements about right and wrong, that's right, that's wrong, you ought to do that, you ought not to do that, are those statements like beautiful sandcastles on the beach? The tide comes in, they're beautiful while they're there, they're intricate, they're amazing, but the tide comes in, washes it away, it's as if it's never been there. Or are they really meaningful things? Watch this short video just to zoom us out to the perspective that I think things have to make sense at. I want to ask the question, is our understanding of right and wrong stable, not just at the everyday level, where we say, yeah, Martin Luther King, he was a great guy, he did the right thing. Is it also stable right out here, right at that zoomed out level? Is it even stable at an everyday level for us to remove God from the picture? When Richard Dawkins was asked by the journalist Justin Brierley, is it conceivable that we could have evolved in a slightly different way? I want you to listen to what Richard Dawkins' response was.
When you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say there is the reason this is good is because it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement?
But my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past, and I suppose.
So therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution.
Well, you could say that, but it doesn't. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural.
Okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
you could say that. Yeah.
I wonder what you make of that. So if at the everyday level there is that consequence to atheism, to naturalism, what is it? How does that connect together with the big picture? Actually, the truth comes from a hitman in a movie that Tom Cruise played a part in. Vincent the hitman, driving around, knocking people off in LA, says, get with it. Millions of galaxies and a speck on one in a blink. That's us, lost in space. The cop, you, me, who notices? I wonder where you ground, where you sit, your views about right and wrong. You see, with God in the big picture, the everyday picture of right and wrong doesn't collapse. With God in the picture, then these cross-cultural moral rules, these principles of right and wrong that people like Martin Luther King appeal to, they make sense because they flow from the outworking of that loving Creator God's character. So many different things we could say here, but I need to move on to our next clue, looking back at Jesus' identity. Who was he? Who was he? Who did he claim to be? Who did people think he was? Well, he claimed to be God. In one encounter in John's Gospel, in John chapter 8, people gathered around him and said to him, Who are you? And Jesus responds, before Abraham was born, before Abraham was, I am. And he uses these words that God used to Moses to describe who God was to Pharaoh. What should I say when the powerful Egyptians ask me, who has sent me? And God says, tell them, I am has sent you. Jesus uses those same words, applies them to himself, and makes an explicit claim to be God. Their reaction immediately follows. They understood exactly what he was claiming. Now, C.S. Lewis worked through the logical possibilities of this claim. Was he lying? Was he mistaken? Did he think he was telling the truth, but he was really sort of a bit crazy? Or was he a bad person? Was he knowingly telling people that he was God and getting them to put their trust in him? And he works through those alternatives that Jesus doesn't seem to be a bad kind of person. He went around helping people and pouring his life out for people and being gentle to people. And he doesn't seem to be somebody who is blind and misguided in terms of what people are like. He seemed to have a depth of perception and an acuteness of insight into the questions of human nature and the human mind and the human soul that nobody had ever seen or heard since. So Lewis said, well, maybe you have to fall towards the conclusion that he may have been God. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. Now, Jesus' case and Jesus' identity was connected into the evidence that he gave. He didn't just turn up and say, I'm God, believe me. In fact, Jesus produced all kinds of evidence for people to actually consciously trust in him. His teaching, his miracles, his works, growing back people's limbs in plain sight, commanding the forces of nature and calming the storms, feeding thousands of people, knowing people's deepest secrets, and then his character, which inspired devotion and loyalty among his friends and those who knew him best, not people who were kept at arm's length, people who knew him intimately, committed more deeply to him. His fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, 300 or so prophecies fulfilled in his life, over 20 or 30 or so fulfilled in one single day in his death on the cross. And then the supreme miracle and validation of Jesus' claim to be God, his resurrection. In fact, one scholar calculated, Richard Swinburne calculated, there was a 97% chance that Jesus, on the available evidence, he sort of plugged all the numbers into probabilities, that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. And even the most skeptical scholars will agree with facts like these. Gary Habermas has collected what he calls the 4 minimal facts, the facts that are agreed on by even the most skeptical scholars and thinkers, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he really was killed. The same Jesus that the history books record was killed on the cross. And even the most skeptical thinkers and scholars, historians, people who don't believe in God and don't believe in Jesus will say, all right, I'll give you that. I think that's probably true. The empty tomb, the appearances to foes, and the appearances to disciples. Tanya talked earlier about the explosive growth of the early church. What would explain that? What would explain the transformation of this murderous persecutor, Saul, into the greatest missionary that they'd seen, the Apostle Paul? It's the same person. His life has completely changed. What explains that? And if you want to look into these evidences, look up Gary Habermas. Read Amy's book, where she goes into some of these evidences and some of these records, where you'll be able to read with your own eyes what the historians wrote about Jesus, what we know about him. And then you'll be faced with the question, how do we explain these 4 facts? We can't just push them off the table and say, oh, they happened a long time ago, therefore they're not relevant anymore. No, Lewis says that's chronological snobbery. We can't think that just because time changes, an argument becomes untrue. You don't tell the time you don't judge fashion by a watch. You've actually got to look at the data as it really is. What's the best explanation for this? And so Jesus' claim, if it really happened, proves everything. If Jesus rose from the dead, said Tim Keller, then you have to accept all that he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what he said? The issue on which everything hangs is whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he actually rose from the dead. Have you looked into it? And then the final clue that I want to talk about is my own experience and the experience of hundreds of people, thousands of people around the world. I arrived at university a skeptical student, wanting to explore questions, but I did not have a Christian faith. And as I started to explore the questions of philosophy, I found that I began to view Christian faith as reasonable. As I began to look into it, as I began to explore it, I began to be persuaded that it was reasonable and real. In fact, the friend who reacted most strongly to that was my friend John. And he said, I can't believe that you've become a Christian. It just doesn't make sense to me. As I eventually moved in that journey and I became a Christian, I became persuaded that my faith was real. And my friend John said, I can't believe that you believe this. Explain to me all of this. And we had lots of discussions and he didn't move. It was such a joy to watch God working in his life over the last 10 years, to see him baptized actually earlier this year. A transformed life. My life, his life, hundreds of other people's lives in this room, reflecting, having met Jesus, having encountered him as a real person, not just an idea in philosophy books, not a person just in history, but a person who's with us here and now, who changes lives. So I give you these 4 clues. I'm going to invite my colleague now, Sharon, to come and join me as we encounter and listen to and try to answer some of your questions. Okay, Sharon, do we have some questions here? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to put you on the spot so I can have a breather.
Okay.
When we talk to God, we feel a connection with him. What do the other religions feel who think they have an encounter with a God?
Thank you for whoever asked this question and for those of you that endorsed it. It's a great question, and there's no question in my mind that people in all kinds of cultures have had experiences that are more than just the physical, and that tells us something in itself, that the view that this world is purely physical is not what we seem to see. People are talking about the spiritual realm all the time, and that's another pointer to the possibility that God might himself be real and that we're spiritual people made to kind of know him. Now, some people may well have had different types of religious encounter. It's obviously hard for us to know what they experienced in that moment, but this phrase, when we talk to God, we feel a connection with him. That's an inherently personal statement, talking about a personal interaction with a God who cares about people. Now, we need to recognize that this is very unique to the Christian faith. Now, I'm going to speak in very broad brushstrokes here about other religions, but the central kind of pieces of what I'm saying do hold. So, Islam means submission to God and surrender. And the goal for the most reverent Muslim is to surrender to the will of Allah. This concept of two-way dialogue, connection to Allah, is not a central tenet of what it means to be a Muslim. Similarly, in Eastern religion, let's take some forms of Buddhism. The goal is actually to transcend. This world is illusory, and it's a secondary concern. The primary concern is to transcend reality into the great consciousness, and that involves forgetting a sense of person, forgetting identity, leaving all that behind. And so But yet, I feel like as a person, I want to connect personally. I'm a spiritual being, but I also want to connect personally. Where does this kind of find its home? Well, it uniquely finds its home with the Christian God, who has become as personal as it is possible to be by entering history as the person of Jesus. This amazing verse from the Lord's Prayer that perhaps some of you have prayed so many times without even thinking about it. Our Father in heaven. That the God of Christianity is somehow transcendent and personal at the same time, and he offers us this connection with him that is both a transcendent God that we can trust, who is in control, but yet he cares about us. He knows you by name, and he even knows things like the number of hairs that are on your head and crazy things like that.
Thank you. So, here's a question. Why do I exist? Why do I exist? Let me try to answer this quite quickly. God's nature is unlike what we might imagine automatically it to be like. God is not sitting on a throne saying, "Come and look at me, aren't I wonderful?" The nature of the God who exists is that this God pours himself out in generosity. The Father loving the Son loving the Father, the Spirit loving the Father and the Son. And out of this generous overflow, this generosity, this charity, this joy that comes out of the very nature of God, comes creativity, comes life, comes creation, comes a cosmos, comes you, and comes me. You are made out of the overflowing love of the Trinity. That's how much you're loved. There's a celebration over your life and in your life, over your very existence. I think that's the root of why all human beings, whether or not they're in relationship with God, have an intrinsic dignity and worth and value, made in the image of God, out of the overflow of the love of God. Okay, that was a quick answer. Can we do one more? Yeah. One more. Okay, we've got 2 more minutes. How do we explain God's existence to friends? Sharon, can you do this in a minute?
I can. What a great question. And this is not easy at times. First of all, we pray. There's a slightly cheesy expression that says, before you talk to people about God, talk to God about your friends. We pray for our friends by name, and then we ask God for opportunities. And we actually, there's a verse in the Bible that says, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you. And actually this sort of flips it on its head and says that if we live in a way that lives the adventure of God that Tanya was talking about earlier, that actually other people will be asking us questions. And that's quite challenging, isn't it? Do I live in such a way that people can't help but ask me questions, where I'm tripping over the opportunities to tell people? There are, in terms of the technical details of God's existence, there are all kinds of things. I like to think of it as a cumulative case, like Tom said, clues on a crime scene. Why we can make sense of the fact that we have a mind to be a scientist, why the universe appears to be finely tuned, why we seem to have religions, whatever the culture, suggesting we're spiritual people, all kinds of things. So pray, live radically, and be ready with a cumulative case for the existence of God.
Can we get away with one more question while people are just feeding in? Is that all right? Let's do one more. Okay. We've done those 3. Okay, so some of these questions talk about, okay, what's the best way for us to have a relationship with God? Is God with us most of the time, or has he always been there but we haven't noticed? Can we ever prove God exists, or is it just circumstantial? What about proof? So let me just say what I started to say at the beginning, just quickly. God gives enough light for those who want to see him, and enough darkness for those who want to hide. God is gentle with the way he shows himself. He doesn't demonstrate himself by forcing himself into our consciousness through mathematical proofs. I think he could do that if he wanted to, but God is interested in creating the possibility of a real, living, loving relationship with you. That's why he doesn't force you to believe in him. He woos you, he appeals to you, he gently puts things around you that says, do you want to look into this more? Do you want to explore this more? Because he wants to affirm the dignity of really you choosing to know him would have. Maybe listening today, listening for you, has been some of those clues being laid out. Maybe some of those clues now are more apparent to you. Can I encourage you to read the Gospels and ask yourself the question, who is he? Who is this guy that did this stuff, that claimed this stuff? Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for listening to me too.